On a serene Sunday morning, Donald Trump awoke in his grand penthouse, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the New York skyline and into his room. The stillness of the moment was rare, a stark contrast to his usual whirlwind of meetings, calls, and public appearances. Today, however, there were no appointments, no pressing demands. He could have spent the day indulging in his luxurious surroundings, but something lingered in his mind, a story he had recently heard. A close acquaintance had mentioned a small church on the outskirts of New York, describing it as a place where judgment often overshadowed compassion. The words struck a chord with Trump. For a man who had experienced the full spectrum of public perception, from admiration to scorn, he couldn't help but wonder about the authenticity of human kindness in such a setting. Sitting by his window, gazing out at the bustling city below, an idea began to take shape. It was bold, unconventional, and, in a way, risky. He decided to test the waters of human behavior firsthand. What if he stepped out of his identity as Donald Trump, the billionaire, the public figure, and presented himself as someone entirely different? What if he appeared not as a man of immense power and wealth, but as a man seemingly at the bottom of society? Determined, Trump rummaged through his extensive wardrobe. He bypassed the tailored suits, the silk ties, and the Italian leather shoes. Instead, he found an old coat with fraying edges, a pair of wrinkled, faded pants, and a knit beanie that looked as if it had seen better days. With a touch of deliberate messiness, he tousled his signature hair, letting it fall into disarray. For the finishing touch, he slung a worn, shabby cloth bag over his shoulder. When he looked at himself in the mirror, the transformation was startling. The commanding presence that usually accompanied him was gone, replaced by an image of a man who appeared humble, worn, and weary. Even he had to admit that the disguise was effective. Stepping out of the penthouse, he resisted the urge to call for his usual car service. Instead, he flagged down a yellow taxi from the busy streets below. The driver, a middle-aged immigrant with a kind face, greeted him warmly. Showing no sign of recognition, Trump smiled inwardly, reassured that his appearance was convincing. As the taxi made its way through the city and toward the outskirts, Trump gazed out of the window, observing the life unfolding on the streets. He saw bustling markets, families walking hand in hand, and clusters of people chatting on street corners. Yet, amidst all this, his mind kept returning to the church and what he might encounter there. Will they see beyond the surface? He wondered, leaning back in the worn seat. Or has compassion truly given way to judgment? The car eventually pulled up in front of the church, a modest building with a weathered facade. Despite its unassuming appearance, there was a certain charm to it. Stained glass windows catching the sunlight, an old bell hanging above the entrance. Groups of well-dressed families were arriving, stepping out of sleek cars and chatting amongst themselves. Trump stepped out of the taxi and paid the driver, his actions slow and deliberate, as if to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Straightening his bag over his shoulder, he took a moment to observe the scene. The sharp contrast between himself and the arriving churchgoers was immediately apparent. Their tailored suits, polished shoes, and designer handbags stood out against his tattered coat and scuffed shoes. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his beanie and made his way toward the entrance. Each step felt deliberate, almost like entering a stage where he didn't belong. He noticed the glances, quick, fleeting looks from the congregants. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few held a spark of judgment, a silent questioning of his presence there. Inside, the church was serene. The faint aroma of burning candles mixed with the earthy scent of the wooden pews. The soft hum of conversation filled the air as people settled into their seats. Trump chose a spot at the very back. hoping to avoid unnecessary attention. From his vantage point, he could see the congregation filling the rows at the front. Men adjusted their ties, women smoothed the fabric of their dresses, and children sat obediently beside their parents. The air seemed thick with the unspoken hierarchy of appearances. As Trump sat quietly, he allowed himself a small smile. This was exactly what he wanted, to witness the raw, unfiltered reactions of people when they were faced with someone who didn't fit their mold. He could already feel the stirrings of an intriguing day ahead. In the distance, the sound of the church bell tolled, signaling the start of the service. Trump straightened in his seat, ready to see how this experience would unfold. Donald Trump stepped into the church with deliberate quietness, his movements barely disturbing the stillness of the space. The polished wooden floor creaked faintly under his worn shoes, but the sound was lost in the low hum of conversation and the rhythmic toll of the church bell. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the serene beauty around him. The arched ceilings soared above, their grandeur accentuated by intricate stained glass windows. These vibrant panes, illuminated by the soft sunlight, cast mesmerizing patterns of blues, greens, and reds onto the walls and pews, creating an almost otherworldly glow. The atmosphere was steeped in solemnity, a quiet sanctity that seemed to encourage reflection. Conversations among the early arrivals were hushed, their voices blending into a gentle murmur that filled the vast space like a comforting blanket. Every element of the church, the flickering candles, the rich scent of polished wood, the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, spoke to its role as a place of reverence. Trump moved toward the back, his posture slightly hunched as though he hoped to avoid drawing attention. He chose a seat in the last row, a shadow among the neatly arranged pews. From this vantage point, he could observe without being observed, or at least without being confronted directly. The back row felt like a sanctuary within the sanctuary, far removed from the clusters of well-dressed congregants who filled the front rows with their quiet conversations and subtle gestures of acknowledgement. The congregation itself was a portrait of understated luxury. Men adjusted their tailored suits with practiced ease, their leather shoes gleaming under the muted light. Women sat with an air of effortless grace, their pearl necklaces catching the occasional glint of sunlight as they turned to greet familiar faces. Designer handbags rested casually by their sides, their presence both subtle and intentional. Even the children seemed to understand the importance of appearances, sitting unusually still in their miniature versions of formal attire, their tiny ties and polished shoes adding to the tableau of refinement. In stark contrast, Trump's appearance was almost jarring. His tattered coat hung loosely on his frame, the frayed edges of his pants brushing against scuffed shoes. The beanie he wore was faded and stretched, as though it had weathered countless winters. His shabby cloth bag, slung casually over one shoulder, seemed out of place in the immaculate surroundings. Each step he took into this world felt like a small act of rebellion, a discordant note in the symphony of polished perfection. Among the front rows, Linda Walker was an unmistakable presence, a middle-aged woman known throughout the community. Linda had built a reputation not just for her wealth, but for her commanding demeanor. She carried herself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance, her every movement calculated and precise. Today, she was dressed in a finely tailored dress that skimmed her figure flawlessly, paired with understated but unmistakably expensive accessories. Her designer handbag sat prominently beside her, its gleaming hardware catching the light as though it had a role to play in her image. Linda's posture was impeccable, her back straight, her chin lifted just enough to convey confidence without appearing overtly haughty. As the church began to fill, her gaze wandered over the growing crowd, pausing briefly on familiar faces. She exchanged polite nods and fleeting smiles, her expressions so practiced they seemed almost mechanical. To Linda, this was not just a place of worship, it was a stage. When her eyes landed on Trump, however, her expression shifted. A flicker of disapproval crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable. Her carefully constructed demeanor faltered for a moment as she took in the sight of him. His worn clothes, his disheveled appearance, his air of quiet anonymity. To Linda, the church was a place for those who belonged. It was a sanctuary for individuals who fit a certain mold: successful, respectable, polished. Trump, with his shabby bag and weathered coat, didn't just stand out. He disrupted the carefully curated harmony she held dear. Leaning slightly toward the woman seated beside her, Linda spoke in a low voice, her tone sharp despite its volume. The two exchanged a few hushed words, their heads tilting toward each other in a way that suggested shared disdain. Linda's gaze returned to Trump intermittently, her eyes narrowing each time they settled on him. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and judgment, as though she were trying to piece together the story behind this anomaly while simultaneously dismissing it as unworthy of her attention. Trump, for his part, remained still, seated at the back, his bag resting at his feet. He appeared absorbed in the surroundings, his gaze forward and unwavering. But he wasn't oblivious. He could feel the weight of the room's scrutiny, the unspoken but palpable judgment that hung in the air like a faint scent. As the bell tolled again, signaling the beginning of the service, Linda straightened in her seat. Her face resumed its practiced composure, her lips pressed into a faint smile that conveyed nothing but control. Yet, even as she turned her attention to the altar, the presence of Trump lingered in her peripheral vision. He was a reminder, subtle but persistent, that the day might not proceed as predictably as she had planned. For the first time in years, Linda felt the faint stirrings of discomfort, a sensation she was unaccustomed to but couldn't quite shake. The service unfolded with a solemn grace, the soft hum of prayers reverberating through the air. The flickering candles along the altar cast gentle shadows that danced on the walls, creating an atmosphere of reverence. The congregation, dressed in their Sunday best, sat quietly, their heads bowed in unison. Donald Trump sat in the back, blending into the shadows, his figure hunched slightly, as if he wanted to disappear into the wooden pew beneath him. When the priest stepped forward and invited the congregation to receive Holy Communion, Trump rose slowly. His movements were deliberate, almost cautious, as though he were mindful of every eye that might be watching. His tattered coat and shabby cloth bag stood in stark contrast to the polished shoes and fine attire of those around him. He began walking toward the altar, each step steady and unhurried. The cloth bag on his shoulders swayed slightly, its faded fabric a silent testament to the role he had chosen to play that morning. As he passed the rows of congregants, a few people glanced up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild discomfort. As Trump neared the front, the edge of his bag accidentally brushed against one of the polished pews. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but to Linda Walker, seated in that very pew, it felt like an affront. Linda, who had been sitting with her hands neatly folded over her designer handbag, stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line as her gaze darted to Trump, who seemed blissfully unaware of the perceived transgression. Unable to contain herself, she rose abruptly from her seat, her movement startling those around her. Her face, usually composed with a veneer of practiced elegance, twisted in irritation. Her sharp gaze locked onto Trump, her voice slicing through the sacred silence of the church. "What do you think you're doing here looking like that? This is a church, not a place for beggars." The effect was immediate. The soft hum of whispers and quiet prayer stopped abruptly. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a palpable tension gripped the room. Some exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Others turned their attention to Trump, their faces softening with sympathy. Linda, however, was undeterred. Her tone, already cutting, grew sharper as she continued, her words laced with disdain. "If you can't respect this place, you shouldn't be here disturbing others. The church is meant for decent people." Trump halted mid-step. He didn't respond immediately, but turned his head slowly, meeting Linda's glare with an unwavering calm. His expression was neutral, not defensive, not angry, just composed, as though her words had barely touched him. The room seemed to hold its breath as Trump's deep voice broke the silence, steady and clear. "I've always believed that the church is a place for everyone, no matter how they look." His words hung in the air, resonating like the toll of a bell. For a moment, no one moved. Linda's face froze, her earlier confidence giving way to something less certain. Her posture stiffened, but the faint color rising to her cheeks betrayed her discomfort. Around the room, a few congregants lowered their heads, their expressions tinged with embarrassment. Others glanced toward Linda, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. The whispers that followed were soft but pointed, rippling through the pews like a gentle wave. Trump said no more. He turned back toward the altar and continued his journey, his steps as steady as before. When he reached the priest, he bowed his head, receiving the Holy Communion with the same quiet dignity that had defined his every action that morning. Linda sank back into her seat, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her fingers gripped her designer handbag tightly, as though it might anchor her in the midst of the growing unease around her. The air felt heavy now, and the whispers that floated through the room only deepened her discomfort. The judgmental glances that had once been directed at Trump now turned toward Linda, their weight almost palpable. She could feel them, the silent condemnation, the unspoken questions, and for the first time that morning, she felt truly out of place. Meanwhile, Trump returned to his seat with the same calm demeanor, his head slightly bowed as he clasped his hands in quiet reflection. His composure was unshaken, as though the incident had never occurred. Yet, his stillness carried a weight, a quiet power that lingered in the room. It was a reminder, unspoken but clear, that the church was meant to be a sanctuary for all, not a stage for judgment. And though Trump remained silent, his presence alone prompted an unspoken reflection that settled heavily over everyone present. As the service drew to a close, Donald Trump rose from his seat at the back of the church. His movements were unhurried, almost meditative, as he blended into the slow-moving stream of people heading for the exit. The atmosphere was subdued, the earlier tension lingering in the air like an unresolved question. Trump's worn coat and disheveled appearance were still a stark contrast to the polished crowd around him, but he walked with quiet confidence, unbothered by the glances that continued to follow him. As he reached the church's exit, he paused. The donation box stood near the door, a simple wooden structure adorned with an engraved cross. Trump glanced at it briefly, then reached into his shabby cloth bag. From within, he pulled out a large envelope, its surface slightly crumpled but deliberately sealed. With care, he placed it inside the box, the action drawing little attention from the congregation. Linda Walker, however, had been watching him from a distance, still reeling from the earlier confrontation. She found herself unable to look away. Her emotions were conflicted, part lingering irritation, part growing curiosity. There was something about his calm demeanor, his deliberate actions, that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. As Trump stepped away from the box, Linda's curiosity got the better of her. She approached the donation box with measured steps, glancing around to ensure no one was watching too closely. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before reaching into the slot and retrieving the envelope. Her perfectly manicured nails carefully tore the edge of the envelope, and as she unfolded its contents, her breath caught. Inside was a significant amount of money, far more than she had ever seen placed in the donation box before. But it wasn't just the money that stunned her. Alongside it was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Linda unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the bold, deliberate handwriting. Never judge anyone by their appearance. True kindness comes from the heart, not from clothes or status. Donald Trump. For a moment, Linda was frozen. Her eyes widened, and her grip on the paper tightened. The words seemed to leap off the page, hitting her with the weight of their truth. She read the signature again, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. A voice from behind startled her. "Don't you see?" Someone whispered loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "That's Donald Trump. He came here disguised to test everyone's compassion." The realization struck Linda like a thunderclap. Her knees felt weak, and her face flushed with heat as if the judgment she had so freely cast earlier now turned back on her. The arrogance and harshness she had shown just hours before now felt unbearably heavy, a burden she could neither ignore nor escape. She stared at the note again, her vision blurring slightly as the words repeated themselves in her mind. The lesson was painfully clear, yet profoundly humbling. Her hands trembled as she folded the note and returned it to the envelope, her heart pounding with the weight of her shame. Outside the church, Trump stood by a sleek black car that had just arrived to pick him up. His posture was relaxed, his gaze calm as he waited. Linda, still clutching the envelope, felt an inexplicable pull to approach him. Her steps were hesitant, her confidence shaken in a way she hadn't experienced before. By the time she reached him, her legs felt unsteady, and her voice faltered as she spoke. I'm sorry. I didn't know it was you. I was wrong." Trump turned to face her, his eyes kind and steady. There was no trace of anger or smugness in his expression, only understanding. A gentle smile curved his lips as he replied, "It's okay. What matters is what you've learned from today." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that lingered in the air. Linda nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. But these weren't the tears of humiliation she might have expected. They were tears of awakening, of realizing how far she had strayed from the values she thought she held dear. The note in her hand now felt less like a reprimand and more like a gift, a chance to grow into someone better. As she watched Trump step into the car and drive away, she stood there for a long moment, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. She wasn't sure what her next steps would be, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of change. The congregation, too, had begun to disperse, though the murmurs about the day's events hadn't ceased. Linda could feel their eyes on her, but for once, she didn't care. Her focus had shifted inward, to the lessons she had just been forced to confront. The profound realization of Trump's actions, his quiet yet powerful message, left an indelible mark not just on Linda, but on everyone who had witnessed the events of that day. It was a reminder that true kindness and compassion are not measured by wealth or status, but by the way we treat others, regardless of appearances. Donald Trump stepped into the sleek black car waiting for him at the curb. As the driver closed the door behind him, Trump took a moment to glance back at the church, its modest steeple silhouetted against the evening sky. The stained glass windows glowed faintly with the light from within, casting a warm, ethereal glow onto the faces of those who remained. Linda Walker stood at the top of the steps, still clutching the envelope in her hands. She was motionless, her mind racing with thoughts she had never allowed herself to entertain before. Around her, the remaining congregants lingered in subdued silence, their earlier conversations replaced by introspection. It was as if the entire church had been frozen in a moment of collective realization. each person replaying the day's events in their minds. Trump's words, simple, direct, and powerful, echoed in Linda's mind like a bell ringing through a quiet valley. What matters is what you've learned from today. She felt the weight of those words pressing against her chest. They weren't accusatory. They weren't meant to condemn. Instead, they were an invitation to change, to see the world through a lens she had long discarded. For years, Linda had viewed life through the narrow frame of status and appearances, believing that wealth and refinement were the ultimate measures of a person's worth. But standing there, the envelope crumpled slightly in her trembling hands. She began to see how blind she had been. The story of the poor man at the church spread rapidly through the community in the days that followed. Whispers turned to open conversations, and soon, everyone knew the truth. The man in the tattered coat and worn-out beanie was none other than Donald Trump. His disguise, his humble demeanor, and his deliberate silence had served a purpose far greater than anyone could have anticipated. At first, people were shocked, even skeptical. Why would he do such a thing? They asked. But as the full story unfolded, his quiet observation, the note he left, the profound yet simple lesson he imparted, it became clear that this was not a publicity stunt. It was a demonstration, a test of compassion, and a challenge to the community to confront its own biases and assumptions. Linda, who had long been regarded as the epitome of refinement but also arrogance, found herself at the center of this moral reckoning. The community watched her closely, expecting her to retreat into indignation or denial. But instead, something remarkable happened. Linda began to change. The woman who once commanded rooms with her air of superiority now sought to understand those around her. She started attending community events, not as a guest of honor, but as a volunteer. She reached out to those she had once dismissed, offering not just material help but genuine care. She spoke less and listened more, her sharp tongue replaced with words of encouragement and kindness. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Linda stumbled, and there were moments when old habits resurfaced. But each time she faltered, she thought of that Sunday morning, of the man who had silently challenged everything she believed. And she found the strength to continue her journey of self-improvement. The congregation, too, changed. Conversations that once revolved around business deals and social standings shifted toward topics of compassion, community, and service. Trump's quiet intervention had created ripples that extended far beyond the walls of the church. For Trump, it was never about recognition or personal gain. As the car pulled away from the church that evening, he leaned back in his seat, a faint smile on his face. He knew that the seed he had planted would grow, not because of who he was, but because of what he had shown them. That true compassion requires no wealth, no status, no acknowledgement. It simply requires an open heart and a willingness to see beyond the surface. And so, as the church slowly emptied and the night settled in, the echoes of that day remained, unseen but deeply felt, a quiet reminder of the profound power of empathy. The story above is not merely a lesson in compassion, it's a call to action. It reminds us that the ability to bring about meaningful change in the world lies within each of us. It doesn't take grand gestures or extraordinary circumstances. It starts with the simplest of actions: a kind word, an open mind, a moment of genuine empathy. Each of these small acts has the potential to create ripples far greater than we could ever imagine. Too often, we allow appearances or preconceived notions to shape our perceptions of others. We glance at someone's clothing, their demeanor, or their circumstances, and we make assumptions. But what if we paused? What if, instead of judging, we chose to listen, to understand? What if, in every interaction, we sought to find the humanity that connects us all? This story serves as a reminder to do just that, to look beyond the surface and let our hearts lead the way. Imagine a world where kindness is the norm, where empathy is our default setting. Imagine if every person you encountered treated you with the same fairness and respect they hope to receive. That's the world we have the power to create, one interaction at a time. Kindness is not just an abstract virtue. It's a transformative force. It has the power to bridge divides, heal wounds, and inspire others to do the same. When we extend a hand to someone in need or offer a listening ear to someone who feels unheard, we are not just helping them. We are contributing to a ripple effect of goodness that can touch countless lives. May you carry the spirit of compassion with you in every step of your journey. May you find opportunities to connect with others in ways that are meaningful and profound. Let empathy guide your decisions, and let the goodness within you radiate outward, touching the lives of those around you. Every moment is a chance to leave a positive mark, to make someone's day a little brighter, to remind them that they are seen and valued. Remember, none of us are perfect, but we all have the capacity to grow, to learn, and to become better versions of ourselves. Strive each day to live authentically, embracing your values and sharing them with the world. Bring joy to others, not because it's expected, but because it's a reflection of the kindness within your own heart. Treat others the way you want to be treated, because kindness is a gift that never goes out of style. And perhaps, as you go through life, you'll find that this simple principle not only changes the lives of those around you, but transforms your own as well.